Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip 21. This is part 4 of my moisture content series, working with dry paper. In this video, I'll be working with an exercise much as I did in part 2 and part 3, only in this exercise I'll be working with dry paper. I'll be using the same loading of the brushes, saturated, damp, and low moisture. I'm going to begin this exercise working with a fully loaded saturated brush. It's loaded with a very moist mixture of water and pigment. And unlike working on saturated or damp paper, where the saturated brush stroke will create a soft edge and flow liberally across the paper, the brush mark will stay in place and give me a hard edge. However, you'll see that a bead of water will form at the bottom of this mark. So the dry paper will resist the flow of that paint. But even though it flows downward, it stops at the bottom of that brush stroke and makes a bead, which I just picked up with my brush. If you leave that there too long, it's going to start to cause backwash or blossoms. By using properly, it will allow you to create a nice even wash when you lead the bead of water down the page. You also notice because I had enough moisture in my brush, I was able to make that brush stroke and give complete coverage as a nice even tone for the distance that I travel with my brush. Now if I come in with just a damp brush, it's still moist but it's not saturated. You can see in parts where I don't have enough moisture to cover the paper for the distance that I'm traveling. It still gives a hard edge, but it's actually broken in some areas, or it left a broken edge because there wasn't enough moisture in the paper and the brush together to give complete coverage. Next, I'm going to take most of the moisture out of my brush, and I'm going to use a thicker mixture of paint without a lot of water in it. And I'm going to make this brush stroke on dry paper, and you can see the texture that it creates and the broken edges that I got by making that mark. I'm going to make another one, and you can see how sparse the coverage is of that brush stroke. I'm going to move on to my small composition, and I'm going to start off by working with a saturated brush. So this brush is loaded with a middle value mixture of pigment, and it's got a lot of water in it still. And I moved to a bigger brush here to give me better coverage. And you can see, as long as that paper is saturated by the brush stroke, that I'm going to get a nice even tone. I can go back in and add to that without any issues as far as backwash, because it's very saturated. And I didn't start with saturated paper. I'm working on dry paper, but I had so much moisture in my brush that when I make that brush stroke, it just saturates the paper and gives complete coverage. And you can see that bead of water, that it's going to stay there until I decide to move it. But if I do leave it too long, it is going to start to backwash. And here you can see where I've changed to clear color. You can see the change in the tone. I just wanted to give some gradation to this wash so you can see that. And that bead will stay put because the dry paper is going to resist it. So the working with the saturated brush on dry paper is a good way to get a nice even wash if that's the result that you're after. Or it's also a good way to get a nice gradated wash if that's what you're after. As I fade out and fade back in here, you can see I'm going to surprise you with another wash that I applied, and my camera failed to pick that up. But I painted the side of that building and gave the suggestion of some grassy shapes there, using the same approach that I did in the sky of this composition. I just took a fully loaded brush and came down the side of that building and let it in right into the grass as one shape. Now I'm coming in with a damp brush, and it has a bit darker value mixture. And you can see it's given pretty good coverage, but I couldn't go very far with that brush stroke. I'd start getting some textural qualities. And if that was a fully loaded brush and I just made that mark underneath the roof, it would have had a water bead there that I could use if I wanted, but I don't really need that. So I'm working with a damp brush on the dry paper, and it gives me very specific brush marks, hard-edged, that stay put, give this clean edge, and I've got just enough paint in my brush to accomplish that. Now I've taken most of the moisture out of my brush, and I'm using a mixture of paint that has less water and more pigment than in the other examples. And you can see that it gives me this nice textural quality. There's often times when this is very desirable. So in this instance, it gives the suggestion of old boards on this structure. And that completes this exercise where I was working on dry paper with a saturated brush, which gave me a nice even coverage in my brush stroke, a damp brush, which didn't give 100% coverage, and it left some textural qualities in the brush mark. I also did work with a low moisture brush, which gave still more texture. In my small composition, I used a saturated brush to make a large wash in the background and on the side of the building, as well as to create some of the ground cover shapes. Then I used a damp brush to paint a shadowed area on the building and do a little bit of more detailed dark valued brush work. And then I used a low moisture brush to make textures on the building. Here I placed the brushwork portion of the exercises from my videos Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4 all side by side. In each exercise, I used a saturated brush, damp brush, and a low moisture brush working from top to bottom. On the left example from Part 2, the brush mark is done on saturated paper. On the middle example from Part 3, the brush marks are made on damp paper. In the last example to the right, which was done in this video, the brush marks were done on dry paper. I'll comment on a few observations as I compare these examples side by side. The top left brush stroke, you're working with a saturated brush on saturated paper, and out of all these examples, you're working with the greatest amount of moisture in your brush stroke because you have a lot of moisture in your brush and a lot of moisture in your paper. Contrasting that, if you go to the complete opposite side and to the bottom right, you're working with the least amount of moisture of any of these examples. You have dry paper and you're using a low moisture brush. If you compare these two brush marks, you can see that the top left one, where you have a lot of moisture, gives you these very soft, diffused, colored, atmospheric brush strokes, where the bottom right gives you this kind of rough, textural, hard-edged brush stroke with broken edges. If I were going to paint clouds, or if I'm going to paint distant mountains or a distant tree line, I'm more likely to use the combination in the very top left with a saturated brush on saturated paper. If I wanted to create atmosphere, that's the combination of brush and paper that I would go to. On the other hand, if I were looking to create the rough texture on a barn or a bark of a tree or ground, I'm more likely to move over to the right and use a damp brush on dry paper or a low moisture brush on dry paper, or possibly even a low moisture brush on damp paper. But that's the combinations I would go to when I want to create some of those textural qualities. If I wanted to put down a very nice even wash or a gradated wash and have a lot of control over where that wash went, even though it was going to be a fluid wash to give me very nice coverage and give me even tone, I'm most likely to go in the very top right corner and use a saturated brush on dry paper, because it's going to give me a fluid mixture of paint, but it's going to be very much in control because it's only going to go where I lead that water bead. So that's the combination I would use if I were putting down a large wash. It's also a combination I would use if I was just painting some detailed shapes. I might go down in size in a brush, but it's going to give me nice coverage, and it's going to help give me some nice, very clean, hard edges. This is why I feel it's important to have a good understanding about moisture content. It gives you predictability. You know what to expect with the given combinations, and that helps you better plan throughout your painting process, and it will also help give you the result that you're after ultimately in your painting. When I paint, I normally start with larger shapes, softer edges, lighter values, and then I move through my painting process and start working with smaller shapes, darker values, and harder edges until I get to the point where I'm doing detail work. That being said, you can see where I would start on the left side of these examples with soft edges, lighter values. It's where I start to create atmosphere in my paintings. After that, I moved to the right across these examples as I worked with different moisture combinations of brush and paper to create more detail and create texture in my painting. And that concludes part 4 of my Understanding Moisture series, working with dry paper. I hope you found this information helpful. Be sure to look for part 5 in this series, where I'll discuss how moisture impacts scraping and lifting. Don't forget to check out Rick Surowicz Watercolor friends and subscribers on Facebook. And as always, if you have any questions about my materials, you can go to the studio page on my website, rsurowitzart.com. If you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.